Okay, no, thank you so much, Phil. Let us indeed keep the first name basis. One of the things that I find a little bit, uncomfortable in the UN system is that it is still very much a protocol-oriented. I would like to turn it into more of a substance-oriented organizations. I think, casual, more informal relationships actually help. As a high representative, I understand that the visit to Monterey is indeed one of the rite of passage. And I still remember the first time I met you. I was like 3 or 4 days old in the current position. I had a privilege of going to a CREMS seminar, and that was a huge learning experience, and I want to formally state how grateful I am, and we are as also ODA, but I am as an individual. I am a non-expert in this field. I'm an amateur, and a lot of the substance that you have given us, a lot of the guidance that you have given me, have been extremely useful. And really contributed to my early sort of formation of how I would like to see. What I saw almost immediately after I took over is a window of opportunity, in fact. I mean, disarmament has been, in a stalemate for the past 20 plus years. But almost immediately, thanks to a man who's sitting there, there was a new marking. I mean, we say that adoption of a treaty and provision of nuclear weapons really did create a new dynamics. It was indeed a very important development. It is controversial. It still is very controversial, very sensitive. But I think it is factually, correct to say that it has indeed created a new dynamics in the nuclear disarmament file. All these things actually guided me to, in fact, think that, perhaps we need something, a comprehensive set of agenda, and with that, together with the dynamics that has been created by the Prohibition Treaty, we might be able to, in fact, reinvigorate a disarmament agenda. So thanks to you and UNN for all these, very important contributions that you continue to make. And also, I should say that the interns are really critical workforce in our office. So my formal thanks to them as well. Because this is an informal setting, I mean, of course, it's recorded, but the agenda, the content of the agenda, you can read. So rather than focusing on my 20-minute or so talk, just going through the summary of this agenda, perhaps I should give a little bit more informal information how we came about, why we thought this agenda was necessary in the time that we're in at the moment in international peace and security environment, and also where the disarmament and arms control discussions are. So let me just say that I just came back from Japan. As usual, I went to Hiroshima, and this year the Secretary General went to Nagasaki. This is the first time the UN Secretary General attended the peace ceremony in Nagasaki, and I could see that he really was very much moved. I think that's the right word. On top of the fact that he had a real good sort of FaceTime with Prime Minister Abe, thanks to the typhoon that hit Japan. We had to take a ride with the Prime Minister's government airplane from Tokyo to Nagasaki. It was a very successful visit, and the most important thing is that I think we made it very clear to the Japanese audience that nuclear disarmament still stands as the priority agenda, disarmament agenda in the UN. And we also had opportunities to discuss the sort of comprehensive nature of our Secretary General's disarmament agenda. The number one reason why we thought we would do this is the international peace and security environment. I think you will all agree that the environment is deteriorating or has deteriorated. You can track the Secretary General's speeches in many different places, the General Assembly, but also repeatedly in the Security Council remarks that he made. He has said that today's international security environment is that we see a Cold War style tensions returning. It's not exactly the same, it's not ideologically driven, so in that sense it's different from the Cold War period, but the style of attention is quite similar to what we used to, people are young and they don't know the Cold War. Some of us, Bill and I, definitely do remember how things were during the Cold War. But that sort of a tension.
Those are the good old days.
Yeah, right. I mean, I still remember my graduate school days at Georgetown, and also my exchange student in Michigan in the 80s. I mean, it was the topic of IR. How to make sure that we defend the free world. Anyway, so it's not ideologically driven today, but the style of tension is definitely returning, and that is very concerning. But into the world that has become much more complex and complicated. For one thing, I mean, no one wants to create a rosy picture of the Cold War period, but during that time, there were channels of communication, there were mechanisms for risk management, risk reduction. The leaders of those two worlds, the superpowers, arms control and disarmament language were, very important for them because they knew that there are risks about nuclear weapons in particular, and so they made sure that the mistakes would not actually, turn very quickly into actual nuclear war. So those mechanisms for communication, risk reduction, management, we don't see it really functioning today, and that's a real concern that we have, and the Secretary General has. And also, in terms of disarmament, multilateral not just disarmament, but multilateral decision-making processes have become much more complicated because we are moving towards a multipolar world. Before, if the two superpowers decided, things happened, but no longer that is the case. So multilateral diplomacy today requires much more skills in order for us to be able to arrive at concrete agreements, and Elaine really went through that very difficult and challenging negotiations, and she managed it with such a skill of bringing together all these different countries. So it's complicated, and conflicts today are really difficult to resolve. It's really protracted. Once it happens, it's very difficult to bring those conflicts to an end. Because again, because of the multiplicity of the actors that are involved. We talk about internal conflicts, but internal conflicts are rarely really internal. They are really very much integrated into regional tensions, old regional conflicts. Some of them, in fact, draw superpowers as well, as we can see in the Syria conflict, or even in Yemen. And the weapons that are intended to be used for battlefields are now so frequently on a regular basis used against civilian populations in urban settings, and casualty. I mean, if you see the casualty in those urban settings, it's more than 90% it's civilians. So if you look at all these environment, it is extremely difficult, and it's very worrying. Not to complicate further, the new science and technologies that are really being developed as we speak. It's also very readily available. It's not like the nuclear technologies, but those new technologies are really out there, and if you have the skills, you can download it, and therefore there is much more serious threats to proliferation and misuse of those largely, hopefully, beneficial, good technologies can be really weaponized, and if that happens, it has actually a potential of really changing the sort of international peace and security scene dramatically, and potentially also have impact on international norms that we have been, creating for the past 100, 200 years. So with all these, looking around the environment, we felt that there has to be some sort of a very comprehensive set of agenda. And when I first talked to him about this, in fact, I mean, this is internal information, but I discussed this already in July last year. I went to the Secretary General to report on the adoption of the Prohibition Treaty and how we might, in fact, take forward a comprehensive sort of disarmament agenda. And then we started to actually reflect, what might be a good way of revigorating disarmament discussions, putting disarmament, arms control, non-proliferation as really a central piece of international peace and security. That's how it started in the UN. It is really a central piece of the founding of the United Nations, and somehow over the past 70 years, it became, I mean, it is always, the first committee, the official title is, it's not just disarmament, also international security. So we wanted to also really make sure that it will be, repositions at the center of international security. And as, someone who has done many different things in the UN, starting with the humanitarian, I did also development and peacekeeping as well. One of the things that I see so clearly over the past, let's say, 20, 25 years is also the evolution of the concept of security itself. It is no longer territorial defense, national security. Disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, of course, are really useful for national security. If you look at some of the important treaties, START and IONP, I mean, they actually were born out of security concerns. But also the concept of security itself has evolved to embrace human security. What kind of a national security is it if the human security is not really ensured and guaranteed? And those two really have to guide the collective security system. And the UN was very much created to ensure international peace and security. So the motivation really came from the environment deteriorating, and then the need to reposition those sets of issues at the core of international peace and security. And then, of course, in the era of Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, which is also a broader, which presents and then gives a huge opportunity for broader security concept, because it is really an integrating concept framework. So all these challenges and small windows of opportunities made us really convinced that it is really timely to come up with this securing our common future. Some countries were skeptical. They always said, well, it's a difficult environment, it's not the time to discuss disarmament. We always said, no, that's exactly why we think it is important. Very interestingly, and then this is what really encouraged me. I mean, during the course of the development of this agenda, we consulted really large number of member states. I mean, I must have spoken to, I didn't have a count, but I must have spoken to 70, 80 member states to understand their perspectives, their priorities, etc. I had 3 civil society consultations. We asked a lot of different people, what you think will be the approach and the priority. And very interestingly, vast majority of member states really welcomed it. And for those who don't come from the UN community, I have to tell you, this is entirely Secretary General's initiative. Usually, UN Secretary General responds to a legislative mandate or request. So in a way, I put the Secretary General at risk because we didn't have any requests. But interestingly, a vast majority of member states, in fact, welcomed the initiative. They felt that it was, for the same reason, they felt it was quite timely. And I should also say that this Secretary General is the first Secretary General to have ever really come up with a comprehensive disarmament agenda. 3, I hope you have glanced at it, or you will be able to look at it. But 3 priorities: disarmament to save humanity. This is a WMD area. And most importantly, of course, nuclear disarmament. And I'll come back to this. And the second is disarmament that saves lives. And I should say that this title really came from the Secretary General himself. He was very deeply involved in the crafting of it, and this second title very much came from his own expressions. And the third one is disarmament for future generations. And in order to make sure that those comprehensive sets of agenda will actually be implemented, the 4th part of the agenda talks about partnership for disarmament. And again, we want to make sure that a little bit beyond diplomats there's nothing wrong with diplomats, but beyond diplomatic, expert field, we think it is very important to further strengthen, and also create new partnerships for disarmament actions. And that includes, for example, more policy dialogues to be conducted systematically between the UN and also regional organizations. It hasn't really systematically happened in the past, and I want to make it more systematic. Gender aspects, women's participation, we discussed that this morning a little bit with Bill and colleagues. But what I want to emphasize here, of course, is young people. We called young people as the ultimate force for change. We want to also make sure that young people are properly capacitated and empowered with the skills and knowledge that is required. I should say that the Secretary General, and he repeated this message in Nagasaki, and I was very happy about that. He chose the launch of this agenda to take place in the University of Geneva, and that was his own idea. He said that we need to make sure that broader public will be engaged, and especially young people. We had to go to, we went to University of Geneva, and they kindly agreed to host that event. So that's how we actually see it. It has to become much more of a sort of broader society, international public opinion, again, understanding and owning this disarmament agenda as part of something that is very important to them. In a little bit of a similar way as the environment has become important, but this is about security, and then we need to really, we hope that general public will understand that it is really about their security, and hopefully people will take a more active interest in disarmament issues. So maybe I will give a little bit of a highlight of what we want to do. One thing I definitely emphasize is that, and this was actually the instruction that I received at the beginning of the process from the Secretary General, he did not want to have any just a fluffy kind of a conceptual paper. You know, he said that it has to be very concrete and practical actions that we can take. I mean, this is Secretary General's, our initiative, so we need to make sure that we will actually be doing something concrete. So the agenda contains 40 different actions, which actually gives me a lot of challenge because, you know, making very clear implementation plan. We're now working on implementation plan for 40 different actions. It actually is quite difficult and it takes a lot of time. But we're now being asked by member states to come up with a clear steps for implementation, and we're doing that. So it's a collection of what we are going to do. So it's not actually replacing or substituting member states' responsibility. The way we wanted to launch this is what we're going to do. Many of them are in support of member states' responsibilities. We want to create an atmosphere and an environment where member states will be able to fulfill their responsibility related to disarmament. So especially in nuclear area, disarmament area, there are a lot of facilitation of dialogues, not just limited to the nuclear disarmament areas, but for example in the future generations part, that would be a disarmament discussions and processes that will probably be done in a very different way from the traditional disarmament negotiations because of the nature of the issues. Most of those dual-use technologies are private sector driven in terms of development. So, you know, just governments negotiating, you know, different things in a conference room will not cut it. So we need to make sure that different stakeholders, scientists, engineers, researchers, and private sector people will also be engaged in you know, thinking through what might be responsible innovation and application of those technologies, what might be code of conduct that they might want to, you know, voluntarily sign up to, and that in parallel, in conjunction, in fully synchronized way with what the international intergovernmental bodies will do. So all these things will actually require someone or some people strategically facilitating and creating platforms for that sort of an engagement. So a lot of those actions that we have put forward relates to bringing people together and providing space and idea so that there will be new approaches, more creative, innovative approaches can be born. So there will be a series of that sort of actions included in this. And then I had interesting, I mean, again, on the science and technology part, I had very interesting discussions, Chris and I, yesterday with some of the tech companies here as well, which was quite fascinating. Going back to the nuclear part, there are also some very important advocacy message that we need to really reinforce. Because of the sort of insecure environment where potentially some people might be thinking about nuclear weapon can be a usable weapon, we really need to counter that. So what we really emphasize as an urgent advocacy point is to appeal to leaders of nuclear weapon states to reconfirm very clearly, very strongly that the old message, again, some of you were not even born, but Gorbachev, Reagan statements, nuclear war cannot be won and therefore it should never be fought. So non-use principle really has to be put back on the international agenda, and we have already started, the Secretary General himself started to give very strong messages on those. And in fact, we are already this is not really for, sort of Twitter kind of activities, but throughout the history, the UN has always done a very important behind-the-scene facilitation, good offices role to encourage important member states to have dialogues. I mean, one thing that that has been recognized, and I can say, is that the crisis over DPRK, the UN Secretary General was also able to make a contribution into that. It was a quite important decision for him to send an envoy to Pyongyang, and I think with that, we have seen some encouraging processes starting. We have to now make sure that it will actually result in the actual denuclearization, CDID, nuclearization, denuclearization, and then we are standing ready always to play a role. If there are anything else that we could do as the UN, we are of course prepared to play that sort of a role. They are also, in a very pragmatic, practical sense, we can do to prepare for the world free of nuclear weapons. Just to give some examples, I mean, there are important discussions that are taking place on nuclear disarmament verification that is taking place. And then I was also very impressed by some of the work that you are doing. I think we need to make sure that those new technologies, how they might be able to contribute to verification work in disarmament areas. I think something we would like to think about, how we might be able to help you feed into sort of those intergovernmental discussions to prepare for the actual nuclear weapon-free world as well. Finally, in the nuclear area, I think it is very important to bring the NPT review process to a success. Our approach on the Prohibition Treaty is very clear. It is a new instrument, a very important instrument that will enter into the toolbox of nuclear disarmament framework. It's not, nuclear disarmament cannot be achieved by one means. We need to make sure that all these tools in the toolbox will be strategically combined and utilized by different member states. So we think that the Prohibition Treaty and the NPT are compatible, and we need to indeed make sure that it will be, it will be understood as such, and it will have to, make sure that the NPT review process will have a concrete result this time in 2020. And then again, there are some practical processes that we are now developing. Now that we will soon have next year the third PredCon, and then a year later already. So we have passed the halfway mark already into the 2020 as well. In saving lives part, this is an area. There are again a whole range of very different kinds of action points that we have put in there. But essentially in this area, there are a lot of things that UN systems can do if we are able to become more coherent. What do I mean by that? They are actually important legal norms, instruments that the member states have been able to create. We want to make sure that these instruments and norms are brought down to the national levels and the regional levels and help them actually to be implemented. In some parts of the world, it will require some capacity building efforts. We can, for example, do quite a lot in the context of peace building or sustaining peace processes as well. Small arms, related issues. If we can integrate and mainstream those conventional weapons disarmament perspectives into the work of a UN country team, or in a peacekeeping context, in peacekeeping missions, then I think we can do quite a lot. So there's a huge opportunity there, and for that purpose, we said that we will be creating a new window in something called Peace Building Fund. This is a Secretary General's trust fund that he has, and he wants to really increase the size of this peace building funds, and then we will be allocating resources from that peace building funds to actions at the country level related to small arms, conventional weapons, disarmament related issues. Another thing, a little bit of a norm setting development in this area, the second area, is of course explosives in populated area. This is also very much a priority for the Secretary General. Again, member states have started to discuss this in the context of CCW, for example. There is still quite a strong reluctance on the part of some of the military. I mean, military forces, they don't like to be restrained in terms of their operational approaches. But I do believe there are ways to go around. In fact, we have very positive experience which we combined, and I know this very well because one of the things that I worked on in my previous iterations is UNAMA Afghanistan, where the data collection on civilian casualty, which the UN mission UNAMA did, and very sincere discussions with the NATO ISAF, and they took very seriously the civilian casualties that they were causing at the time. And NATO entirely reviewed and revised their targeting procedures, and thereby able to, in fact, reduce civilian casualties dramatically. So today, the civilian casualties in Afghanistan is caused primarily by the insurgents, and NATO's work, important part of NATO's work today in Afghanistan is also to train the Afghan National Military Forces to make sure that what they call collateral damage is not big. So there are things that we can do, and then all these is based on the data that we collected. Data and advocacy discussions, dialogues, and negotiations, in fact, were able to reduce civilian casualties. And then this actually, if we can, and I'm not saying that ODA will do all this, the data collection will be done by the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. So this is why I say this is not the ODA's agenda, this is the UN's agenda, and therefore we are very much working together with our internal UN partners as well. If we can bring those disarmament dimensions, there are in fact still a lot of things that we could do in the saving lives part of disarmament agenda. This is just an example, but I just wanted to point out that there are things that we could still do and demonstrate results. The third part I already mentioned, but this is an area, discussions are starting to happen at the UN between governments. In the cybersecurity, there were already 5 group of governmental experts, GGE, and it looks like there will be another one next year. In the areas of lethal autonomous weapons, the application of AI technologies. Also, there is an important meeting of GGE taking place in Geneva later this month, which I think will be a really critical one. Again, here the UN actions are, well, one thing important is that the Secretary General has taken a clear position when it comes to use and application of lethal force, military force. Humans must remain in charge. We cannot delegate the decision to apply force to machines. So that was a very important statement from the UN Secretary General. But now we need to really deepen our discussions on how to go about what kind of norms and who should be involved in that norm making. As I mentioned already, one of the very important parts of our role will be to make sure that the actors who need to be involved in these discussions will be involved, and then we would like to make sure that there will be platforms and places, the space where we can ensure proper involvement of those different stakeholders in those discussions. This is a very important area, probably very challenging. Again, we need to be creative and innovative. We can't just have governments discuss this. We need to make sure that the important actors, other actors are involved, and it's not in the sort of DNA of the UN to immediately involve those different actors. So I think it would be very important for us to be able to play a sort of facilitation or the convening role properly. I mean, we can probably do a lot of learning from the process that you run. The Prohibition Treaty had much more participatory way of negotiating, but we're not yet there in this third area of future generations. We're not there yet in terms of a negotiation starting. But that's why, I mean, I'm a born optimist. If you're not an optimist, you can't work for the UN. But because because this is a new area, and because it has not yet actually fixed in terms of processes, I think that the UN can also play a useful role. My conversations yesterday also gave me a lot of ideas and see what might work and what might be difficult. So I will stop here. Sorry, I spoke a little bit longer than